Hello and welcome to this short introductory video into FarmFlight and our partnership with the University of Nebraska TAPS program. My name is Michael and I'm an account manager for FarmFlight. Let's dive in and see what FarmFlight is all about. So FarmFlight is a UAV imagery company for agriculture. Now, as you can see in this picture as an example of one of our VTOL UAV aircraft, we don't just operate like a quadcopter or a fixed-wing UAV as many are accustomed to nowadays in agriculture. This particular drone allows us to take off and land just like a quadcopter, but once it gets up to a preset altitude, the motors transition and allows that UAV for forward flight. What this allows us to do is take off and land in much smaller areas. We don't need to essentially crash land our fixed-wing drone, which oftentimes messes up the calibration of the sensors on board or could even damage the sensors or the aircraft. It also allows us to cover a lot more acres than a standard quadcopter can while still capturing very high resolution imagery, oftentimes that of what you're accustomed to with your quadcopter. Now, FarmFlight does offer several different layers. It's not just an RGB or a color layer with an NDVI layer. We also provide thermal, which is very critical as we go through the growing season for monitoring those irrigation issues, whether it be subsurface or through a pivot perhaps. All of our NDVI is actually calibrated as well through light sensors. So you know the NDVI and NDRE layers that you get on the account and what you see online is actually how that crop looks through a multispectral sensor. Now, using this high resolution imagery, we're able to run several different analysis off of this to help our clients, one of them being weed detection and then mapping. Just imagine, if you will, being able to look across the field and see where every weed is and then taking your sprayer out and only spraying those targeted weeds. Well, FarmFlight allows you to do that. There's no need to go buy a brand new sprayer and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars when you can use this technology. Maybe you're using a drone for your own spraying operations, or maybe a spot sprayer if you're organic or a specialty crop situation. Now you know exactly where you need to spray and what you'll find when you get there. Now, of course, if we can locate weeds, we can surely count corn plants and even soybeans and wheat as well. Here's an example of one of our cornfields. As you can see, the image on the right is our RGB or color image, if you will. This allows you to ground truth the image, so you don't just have to go off what the analysis came back with. You can actually see here the yellow boxes mean that it's less than 75% of our total planted population. The red, of course, means it's less than 50%. This, of course, will then allow you to create a variable rate planting file. So not only do you know the areas to go replant, but you also get a good understanding of how many plants are actually out in the field. Because as the report shows at the bottom right, it counts every single plant. There's no more summary of how the field is looking or taking a picture every 5 acres or 3 acres. You take a picture every few seconds, if that. And so every single acre of that field is mapped and also counted. This allows you to get a 100% visualization across that field and understand what's truly going on at the very start of the growing season. Now, a lot of people will ask, I know the difference that, drone and satellite and airplane have, but is it really worth the extra? Well, here's a prime example. So the image on the bottom left was a satellite. This is only a few meter resolution. In the same day, we actually flew that same field with one of our UAV aircraft. Now, as you can see, we have a lot of things going on in this field, but the satellite image doesn't really show the full detail and extent of the damage created by a missed application, or an incorrect application rather. And so what this grower was able to do is create a variable rate file where instead of his spreader, spreading out 60 feet to top dress his corn, he managed to dial down that spreader to about 30 feet and then went in between every single pass and was able to even all of that out. So it's very exciting. It's very interesting to see the different use cases that come in. I already have hundreds of use cases in just a few years of using imagery myself, and this type of resolution takes it to a whole new level. So back on the thermal layer. Now this, like I said, it works really, really well for irrigation, but you can also use it in many different ways to see crop health and understand before it starts changing that plant on the NDVI, we'll start seeing that plant heat up. Now, in this case, we're using it on a pivot. So you can see on the pivot, we have a nice blue circle around the field. This means that part of the field is just simply cooler than the other parts of the field. In this case, there was a boot that had a hole in it. Now at this point, the grower's not too concerned. It's okay, the corn's small. We're not putting on that much extra water, but within a few days or weeks of running this pivot almost constantly, that hole is going to get bigger and bigger, which will then result, of course, in a loss of pressure downstream of that boot, and will then, of course, start to deluge water down right below it, causing damage not only to the plant, but also to the soil itself by having erosion occur in that specific area. Now, how does a thermal work across the field? Well, I touched on being able to see that crop health a little bit different than the NDVI, and here's a prime example. In the two images here, you can see we have a color RGB image, and the one on the right is our thermal. Now there's a few areas that stand out here, and including at the bottom right, you can start to make out we have different passes in here, or maybe we have over-applied some of our fertilizers, and it's a little bit cooler. It didn't get spread out completely. But if you notice on the left-hand image here, you can start to see, it's not quite as green as maybe the rest of the field, but it really doesn't look that bad. When we look on the thermal, however, we can really see this area of the field is much warmer than the other parts. This tells me that we have significant crop stress going on. And while the RGB doesn't show it, the multispectral oftentimes won't either until a few weeks, because it's, of course, going off of how those leaves look to a multispectral sensor. So when those plants start heating up, that's the first sign that we have an issue and we need to figure out what it is and correct it to save our yield. So as we've made it through the season, a lot of people say, hey, I get to July and August, I've variable rated my nitrogen off imagery, I've managed my weeds, and I know what I have for stands, I'm done with imagery. Actually, there's a few more use cases. In this case, this is all about harvest timing. Now, this is a plot situation, so it's a little bit easier to understand than on a broad spectrum agricultural operation where you have thousands and thousands of acres. But just imagine, if you will, that these fields are all spread out. Now, the farmer will, of course, know that he planted fields in a certain location before, maybe the opposite side of his farming area or the county. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those specific fields are going to be ready to harvest first. It may have had more stress where he planted later on in the season, and those plants matured out quicker. So by using imagery, he can start to identify fields that have low vigor, or they're starting to dry down, or maybe they're still really green. And we need to kind of think about how we're going to harvest this, because there's a lot of variability here across this farm. How do we need to set those combines up? Do we have enough propane to run our heater if we're drying this crop down? Just a few examples of harvest timing usage for imagery. Now let's take a look at how imagery actually looks. So in that cornfield example I showed earlier, this is the same field. Now this is early on in the growing season, and this is with our high-res camera. And you can really start to see, now this is strip till, and you can see where we've got weeds, and you can start to see, where our strips are, and really start to identify areas in the field that are of concern, including these areas here where we are retaining some moisture. And then if we go to the north end of this field, you'll really start seeing horizontal lines right through here where we're starting to keep that moisture in the field longer than we really kind of want to. So this would be a great example to take to the landlord and say, I'm thinking about putting tile in this field. Well, tile is very expensive, and oftentimes the landlord will say, I don't know if it's worth it or not for me to share that cost with you. Well, if you show them this image, let alone the image you show them mid-season of the stress, which we'll get to in just a moment, they'll start seeing where they're holding the water, and then you'll start seeing increased pressure through here. It's a good visualization into how that field will benefit, not only from tile in this case, but maybe another pass of herbicide, or maybe we need to do a passive tillage, depending on your situation. Now, we fast forwarded over a month now, and this is on July 6th. Now you can see these same areas that were showing excess moisture on our bare soil really don't have much in the way of the corn stand right now. So as we go across the field, you can really start to see some variability throughout the crop. We'll go to our NDVI layer here, and you can really start seeing some past issues through here that are really showing up that we may need to correct moving forward. Now these are oftentimes problems that, like I said, have accumulated over many years, and so it's hard to just take care of them in a short time, but it gives you a good place to start. Now, we just talked about harvest, and if I'm using this image, which this is one of my own fields, and I did this the other day, we can actually start going out. Let me go back to the NDVI, and we can start doing yield estimates. Now this corn is actually just starting to tassel, and so what we did was we went out to the darkest green areas, and we started looking at those ears that the plant was setting. Now it's still kind of hard to count the kernels and understand the exact potential yield, but you start understanding the size of the cob that it's setting. You can start understanding the stress that that plant is under, and you can start kind of getting a rough estimate on your yield. Now we went up to the areas here that are just yellow. Obviously those cobs that we found were a little bit smaller. The ears were a little bit smaller. And then of course in here where it's red, they were non-existent really. Or if they were, the ears were very small. And so what we're able to do then is say, you know, we have X number of acres that are green. We have X number of acres that are yellow. And then of course in the red. So what this tells me is if I have say 150 bushel where it's green and 130 bushel where it's yellow, I can then take those acre numbers, put them in a formula, and really very quickly be able to come up with an approximate yield for this field, and make sure that, you know, maybe I need to sell some more, maybe I oversold. And so we want to make sure that we have everything in order when harvest time rolls around to run as smooth as possible. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at the information on the screen or get a hold of your local UNL TAPS representative. We appreciate your time. Have a great growing season.